Well, hello, everyone. I'm Carl Plantinga, and this panel is about the work of a grant that the four names you see, the four people you see up on the screen received some 3 or 4 years ago. And the grant is from the Templeton Religion Trust, which grants all sorts of intellectual pursuits. This is under one of their engagements, which is called Art Seeking Understanding. And the question that this funding strategy asks is there an empirical connection between art and understanding? So all of the various grants that were given are using empirical methods in addition to philosophical and theoretical methods to explore this question. So I'm going to start by assuming that screen narratives are a type of storytelling. And I'd like to sort of frame this discussion by talking about some of the evolutionary or long-term functions of storytelling in culture. You're probably familiar with a lot of this work, so I'm going to go through it very quickly. But Dennis Dutton, for example, talks about storytelling as a kind of counterfactual information processing, whereby you can explore all sorts of situations that you might never encounter in your actual lives, virtually in the realm of fiction, narrative fiction. E.O. Wilson, the evolutionary biologist, talks about art and especially narrative storytelling as having the capacity to make us more flexible and sophisticated in our responses to new situations. And Brian Boyd, in his books on storytelling, the evolutionary functions of storytelling, talks about improvements in pattern detection and improvements in the interpretation of events. So these are long-term benefits of storytelling, how they function within human cultures over eons of time. But let's move in a little bit to a more focused discussion. Let's talk about some of the social functions of storytelling. Fictions are vehicles for pleasure and play. I think that most of us would agree with that. But that doesn't mean that's their only function. I think that one of the great things about stories is they can do more than one thing at once. And they can also serve as warnings. They can serve as protests. They can serve as ways to educate us about various things. They can ask questions. They can do all sorts of things. Stories are instruments of action. They, contra Kant, who said that art was purposelessness that had a purposeful look to it. I think that the arts are instruments of action that can be used for all kinds of very practical purposes, besides merely giving us aesthetic, well, not merely, aesthetic delight is a great thing. But aside from aesthetic delight and the pleasures and appreciations that they offer. And in addition to that, pleasure is a motivation for all sorts of possible social benefits of art, right? So we have exploring possibilities, exercising the imagination, rehearsing cognitive and emotional skills, theory of mind skills, which we can obtain through fictions. Several different observers of the arts have talked about the arts as, or especially the narrative arts, as flight simulators for social cognition. And I think that's an apt metaphor. Now, storytelling is just one of these aspects of social cognition, one type of social cognition. I mean, moral understanding is one of the social benefits of fiction, is what I wanted to say. And I'm not going to define moral understanding, but I'm just going to give you some examples of it and hope that you will recognize these as legitimate. Storytelling can ideally help us to have a more sophisticated understanding of the moral quality and demands of an issue. It can help us to recognize that different perspectives are possible. It can help us to recognize the consequences for diverse characters in various situations. And it can help us to recognize that our initial intuition about the implications of some aspect of a story might be faulty. So this panel is about the work that we're doing, and we're all doing different sorts of work. You already heard Dan Levin talk about some of the work that he's doing in this regard in the very first panel of the conference, I believe it was. So I'm going to talk about what I'm doing, the work that I'm doing for this grant. Allison Eden is going to talk about movies, morality, and memory, some of the empirical work that she's doing. And then Murray Smith is going to end the panel today by talking about his idea of reflective equilibrium in relation to moral understanding. So we don't have much time, so what we're going to do is, I know that Allison's solution to that is to talk really fast. I am not able to talk so fast, so instead I'm going to skip some of the things that I had hoped to do. But my talk is going to be about the book that I'm writing in relation to this. It's a book that focuses on the experience of narrative engagement in relation to the moral imagination. So how does the moral imagination relate to moral understanding? Well, my idea is that to try to identify the means by which diverse audiences coming from many different backgrounds actually get improved moral understanding is a very difficult task. So I'm going to do something a little bit less complex and less ambitious. I'm going to try to determine how films can get us to think about moral issues, regardless of whether it later leads to moral understanding, although in many cases I think most of us would agree it might. So this book considers the exercise of the moral imagination to be one means of developing moral understanding, but it's agnostic into whether it always does, or there are no necessary and sufficient conditions for leading to moral understanding. But if we can just get people to think about issues of social justice, for example, I think we would all agree that that's a good thing. So I'm just going to briefly go through the contents of the book, and then I'm going to talk about one aspect of it. The book comes in 3 parts. They range from the very general, and by the way, this book is still in process. It's being considered by a press right now, and I will probably revise it before it's published. But I've got a good first draft going. The first part of the book is very general. It has to do with the place of stories and the human imagination. And it deals with various sorts of issues, which I'll go through in a moment. But the second part of the book is a little bit more focused. It has to do with developing a model of narrative engagement. And the third part of the book extends the model into some very sort of more specific kinds of narratives, but you'll see that in just a minute. So part 1, the storytelling and the human imagination. I deal with various disciplinary approaches. This book is interdisciplinary because I was forced to do this by the nature of the grant, and it's very difficult to learn about other disciplines. These silos are very large, and they involve learning new methodologies and new terminologies and new concepts. And so that's one of the things I deal with in the book. But the disciplines that I'm the most interested in for this particular project are, of course, film and media studies, especially cognitive studies, philosophy, and especially philosophical aesthetics, and then media psychology, which is a field that I had a little bit of knowledge of, but now I have a little bit more after doing a lot of reading. Then I deal with the relationship between stories and stories on screens. Then I deal with the kinds of imagining that we might expect would come from engaging with narratives. And also important are the various motivations for screening. I think that this was a bigger issue in media psychology than it has been in philosophy, philosophical aesthetics, which tended to assume a sophisticated art spectator. And film and media studies, which also tended to assume someone who is primarily interested in film as an art. But the idea of what motivates us to view was a bigger issue in media psychology. I can't really get into that right now. Part 2 of the book develops a model of narrative engagement. Before I do that, I argue against certain concepts that I believe have really misled people in thinking about what it means to engage with a narrative. And these ideas are transportation, immersion, absorption, and then of course identification, which I talk about later on in the book. Then I develop my own model of narrative engagement. I make a distinction between what I call smooth and rough engagement. Rough engagement is engagement that demands something beyond the cognitive fluency of the spectator, so that there's a bit of a challenge. And my argument is that when a story challenges us in various ways, it can do this through content, through form, through style, or through any combination of those, that it can elicit deliberative thinking, which I think is a prerequisite to some sort of deeper moral engagement and imagination. Then I deal with character engagement, and I fit that into the theory of narrative engagement as nested within narrative engagement overall. And then in part 3, I extend the model to deal with various issues. For example, the medium. How do literature and film, film using obviously images and sound, how do they engage the imagination differently? That's what I deal with in that chapter. I talk about form and, for example, endings, structures, the 3-act structure, various ways that form can elicit imaginings in viewers. I deal with emotion and in relation to the same topic. And then I get more specific, and I talk about what Meta Hewart calls feel-good films. And the question I ask in that chapter is, can feel-good films ever give us rough engagement? Or do they always offer a smooth engagement, which is conventional and which relies on emotional responses that we've all had before? Can there be anything surprising that engages us and leads to deliberative imagining? And then the last chapter is about the recent phenomenon of rough heroes or anti-hero protagonists and ways to think about that. I'm really interested in that topic, but I can't talk about it today. I don't have enough time. But what I do want to talk about in the 3 minutes I have left, I'm going to go a few more minutes longer, is the narrative. Somehow it got reformulated badly here, but anyway, I developed a model of narrative engagement. And what I'm trying to do is develop a model that's general enough that it will apply to various forms of narrative engagement, but employs constructs that allow us to understand how various contextual and audience differences can alter the way we engage with narratives. So the contextual influences are social and cultural norms, audience characteristics, role dynamics, environmental conditions, and what kind of a thing it is. Of course, our engagement with a narrative depends on our knowledge of generic convention, what kind of an audience we are and we see it with, the situation. And one of the reasons that I reject terms like identification, transportation, and absorption is that they imply a kind of a passivity that I think is exactly wrong. I think that film viewing is a task-oriented activity, and what kind of a task we engage in depends on what kind of a thing it is, what kind of an audience member, what kind of an audience we're seeing it with, etc. So because I don't really have time, I'm going to skip this. My model, which is called the narrative character engagement model, has two parts, and the first is the attentional activities that are engaged in by the audience. I think the most important one is comprehension, but interpretation and aesthetic and moral evaluation are also fundamental elements of the way we engage with narratives. So the cognitive activities that are involved in engagement are much more complicated than simple comprehension, although that is the first and foremost aspect. With regard to character, which of course is nested within narrative comprehension, we need to decide what the character is thinking and feeling, and we need to interpret the character's activities, and moral evaluation, I think, is also a fundamental part of narrative engagement. And it's still open to me whether personal reflection can be considered to be an aspect of narrative engagement, and I think that in some cases it can. There are certain filmmakers who obviously design into the film various kinds of gaps or lyrical scenes, or they slow things way down. They use pacing in order to encourage a kind of reflection while you're watching the film. The second aspect of the model is congruent affect. And if I had more time, what I would do is I would show you how these different possible contextual differences and audience differences could lead people to have different forms of engagement. But these are sort of just the general contours right now. But narrative emotions are an important part of this. Direct emotions like interest, suspense, surprise, and curiosity. But also character emotions and affects. So we have affinities for characters, we have sympathies, antipathies for characters, empathy, mirror responses, and what you could call character emotions: admiration, elevation, moral disgust. That's another fundamental element of character engagement. And then, of course, there are all sorts of affects beyond emotion. So my talk was merely designed to give you a sense of what we're doing, or what I'm doing as a part of the grant. And next we're going to hear from Allison Eden, who's going to talk about what she's been doing as a part of our grant work.
Thank you, Carl. I feel like, to spite you, I should just talk as slowly as possible now for the next 20 minutes, but then we will maybe not learn anything. So thank you very much for having me here. Carl already introduced the project. I was brought on as sort of a media psychologist to talk about how we could measure some of these things, if we can measure some of these things, and what that might look like. So I know that we started the grant talking about moral understanding, but again, like Carl, I'm also not going to define moral understanding because that's a separate enterprise on its own. Instead, what I wanted to do was break it down to how can we understand or think about moral learning from film more broadly. And to do that, I'm going with a fairly standard sort of media psychological paradigm where we start with content analysis of what sort of content is in the film or in the media of choice. We then do some reception analysis, so how people respond to the film or the content, and look to see how that affects outcomes that we're interested in this case, learning about morals or learning moral understanding. So you can see it's a fairly simple sort of directional arrow from content through processing to effects. One of the reasons, I think that, I don't actually know the reasons Carl asked me to be on this project, but I think one of the reasons is because we had worked together talking about character engagement and moral understanding with his earlier project, Screen Stories and Moral Understanding, in which a colleague of mine, Matt Grizzard, and I really focused on the role of character in moral understanding, and we developed this model, the Character Engagement and Moral Adjustment Model, which tries to predict how specific attentions towards the characters, the appraisals of the characters, affiliation or liking of characters, and assessment of outcomes might lead to moral adjustments on the part of viewers. So we detail this in these two papers. If you're interested, in the interest of time, I'm going to direct you to those where we explicate these terms a lot more fully. But we tried to capture this in an empirical way for the current part of the project where we were looking at, can we sort of model this in a lab setting? So how do we do that? Can we simulate these effects? Can we in some way mimic the process of watching a film and engaging in some sort of moral learning in the lab? So hopefully, right? What we did is we took a list. First of all, we had a large survey of meaningful films that changed minds. This paper is currently in press. Rana Havacourt is the lead author, where we looked at people listed a whole bunch of meaningful films that changed their minds about some sort of moral issue. From that, in a discussion with the other PIs of the grant, we narrowed this list of films to 85 films, and this was based on conversation between Dan, Carl, Murray, and myself, where we said, like, okay, well, what films do you guys use in your philosophy? Yeah, you didn't. You were an essential part of this. What films do you guys teach in your film philosophy classes? What films are recent? What films might our students like and be interested in? We narrowed this list, this big list we had, to about 85 films, and had another sample come in and rate them on different dimensions, like how much did they enjoy it? Had they seen it before? Had they thought about the film after viewing it the initial time? We did a cluster analysis on those ratings, basically, and got two big clusters of films initially. That looks like three, but it's really two. Now, what you might notice is this is Black Panther and The Woodsman, and these films are very, very different. Specifically, when we think about our sample population of interest, which is Michigan State University students, a lot of our students had seen Black Panther, and very few had seen The Woodsman. So we ran this cluster analysis again, controlling for seen before. And when we did that, we actually came up with two fairly solid clusters of films. And they're very imaginatively named here, Cluster 1 and Cluster 2. This is not to lead you in any direction. So what we were looking at was, how are these films similar or different based on how the students had rated them along different attributes? And the main difference, if you look at here, we've got enjoyment. Oh, I'm afraid to press a button. Does this make a light? Okay, yeah, it's good. So we have enjoyment here, which you can see is pretty consistent across the clusters. Thought about is a little bit different. Hard to judge was how easy or hard it was to judge the main moral of the story, whether or not there was a clear moral explicated, whether or not there was an ending, a clear ending explicated, and then empathy, which is off on this screen, but you can see over here. And that's really where we found the main difference, right? So the main difference between Cluster 1 and Cluster 2 was this empathy for characters, which is great and really aligns well with other models of how we learn from characters when we feel with or for them, right? So we thought, okay, cool, we've got something here. We've identified these two clusters of films, and remember, these were all films that had been previously identified as being ones that had changed people's minds about something. So these were already morally salient films, films that people had said, yes, this changed my mind about something important, right? So can we test how they work? Well, in order to do that, first what we wanted to do, again, is go back to that sort of diagram of the content to the brain to the effects. We wanted to look at the content. What is it about these films that might be provoking moral change in the viewers? So to do that, we used an analytic technique where we identified decision cycles of characters in the film. So we looked at points in the films where characters were faced with at least two options, and they had to make a decision between them. This is a method that I've used before in analyzing The Sopranos, Leon the Professional, and American Psycho, and it maps pretty well onto sort of these important parts in films that are linked to outcomes that we care about, like enjoyment, appreciation, empathy, changes, and moral decisions. So we had 4 coders for each film. We trained them to identify these narrative cycles in films. We trained them on The Dark Knight and Hunger Games, which I'll tell you about why in a second. And we were able to get an agreement level that was fairly high, particularly for this type of detailed analysis across different decision points across all these films. What films did we eventually select? Well, one of the reasons that we used The Dark Knight and Hunger Games as training instead of films that we were going to show to our large group was because at Michigan State, unfortunately, we had a violent incident right about the time we were collecting these data, and we wanted to remove any films that had violence as the main sort of mechanism for solving problems in the film, right? So we eliminated the most violent films. Then what we wanted to find was films that we could select one from each cluster, Cluster 1 and Cluster 2, with the same gender protagonist that also had very clear decision points that our coders were able to identify. So because of that, we came up with the Truman Show and Social Network, which again were one film each from each of those clusters, clear decision points, clear protagonist, and no violence as a mean of solving the issue. These are the decision points that our coders identified in the film. So this is sort of a rough sketching out of all the scenes in both Truman Show and Social Network. And as you can see, we were able to identify sort of these key decision points in the films that our coders said, hey, this is a point where the main character is making some kind of moral decision. Okay, you guys with me so far? Not too fast? Is it okay? Okay, I'm doing what I can, Carl. I did delete a lot of numbers to get here, so you're welcome. So we took these two films, right? So we're on like study 3 of this one study. My friends call this the never-ending project for a reason, right? So now we're finally ready to test these films in an experimental way and see, hey, do they lead to some kind of change in moral learning? It was a 5-stage testing process, right? So we have a pre-test where we look at viewer characteristics like moral salience, so how important different moral issues that they are, theory of mind, preference for different kinds of films. Then we had them in a film viewing situation, which was like this, right? So we invited them into an auditorium in large groups to watch one of the two films. These were my students in my Intro to Communication class, so they didn't have a choice, but I think they liked it. And then post-viewing, right directly after the film, we measured how engaged they were with the film. We had them rate the characters along the dimensions that Matt Grizzard and I identified as being important for character engagement. So how much did you pay attention to the character, how consistent were the character, and how much did you like the character. We also got the character's morality rated on the Moral Foundations questionnaire. So how important were different moral foundations to the character when they were making decisions. Directly after, so that was directly after the film. 1 day later, 24 hours later, they were pinged. They had to write a survey. Directly after, they also said what was the most important scene of the film, and what was the moral of the film, or what was the plot? What was the plot of the film? 1 day after, 24 hours later, they were pinged again, and we said, hey, okay, you've had 24 hours to think about it. What do you think was the most important scene in the film? And then a week later, we did it again. Hey, what was the most important scene of the film? We did ask for the most important top 3 scenes, but we've only analyzed the top scene right now, so just the most important scene. We also asked them retrospective imaginary involvement, how much did they think about the film after, and we had some guided reflection, which again I won't talk about today. The retrospective imaginary involvement I presented with a poster on Wednesday, so I'm happy to talk more about that later. Today, I'm just going to talk really about sort of these 3 points, just as sort of a this is really where the meat of the study was. So how many participants did we have? 368. They were mostly women. What were the measures that we used? These are the measures I just talked about in sort of the walkthrough, right? So the CMAM measures, the engagement with the film, character morality, open-ended recalled scenes. These are the directly post-viewing ratings for both Truman Show and Social Network. I know these numbers are small, so I'll just walk you through them. So these are the CMAM measures. This is the character engagement and moral adjustment measures, affiliation, attention, and consistency. These are the moral foundations, so care, fairness, loyalty, authority, purity, although purity wasn't terribly reliable, which is why it's italicized, so don't look at it too closely. And then this was engagement, which was just on a 0 to 100 scale of how engaged were you while watching the film. And the take-home message here is that across all metrics, Truman Show was better than Social Network. Our students really liked it a lot better. They were more engaged with it. They liked the character a lot better. And what's interesting is that that didn't come out in our initial survey, but we saw it in the experimental survey, so sometimes these things happen. But we did see some differences across the film, so more liked, more attention, more engagement. Also had slightly higher morality, except for in loyalty and authority, where Mark Zuckerberg was rated higher than Truman. So, okay. Those are the ratings. You could kind of put them in the back of your mind. Let's go to like sort of the more interesting, fun stuff, right? So if we think about these sort of, the scenes, the films, even though Truman Show was liked more, or sorry, the character was liked more, the film itself was not liked a whole lot more. So the character was liked more, but the film itself, they still liked Social Network. So even though they were similarly rated on this enjoyment, there were some differences in how people were experiencing the characters. Okay, well that's sort of interesting because in our model we are looking at how characters might lead to different sort of engagement with the different engagement with moral issues. So okay, how does this differential character engagement affect memory for scenes from the movie, right? So this is a comparison of the moral decision point scenes which were identified by the coders in the content analysis versus all the other scenes in the film. right? So it's basically a 1-0 coding. Moral decision scene was a 1, non-decision scene was a 0. And as you can see, and perhaps unsurprisingly, because you guys all study film, those decision points where the characters have to make a major decision were the ones that people ranked as the most important scenes, overwhelmingly. And this was something that was consistent across time, so not just post-viewing, but also 1 day and 1 week post-viewing. But because we had the directly post-viewing self-report measures that I presented on the last slide, and we had then these time-ranked memory things, this also let us do a nice little logistic regression here where we could say, okay, well, what are the odds of remembering a moral versus a non-moral scene if we put in as predictors the directly post-viewing ratings, right? So what do we see here? So that here you can see these are the post-viewing ratings: affiliation, engagement, attention, consistency. Those are the CMAM and engagement measures. These are the character morality measures. Again, I took purity out because the reliability was low. We didn't need it in the model. This is movie, or social network is 0, Truman Show is 1. And then what was neat about this regression, or about this logistic regression, is we were actually able to code time in there as well, so we could see if these effects were stable across time. So not just directly after post-viewing, which is the base model, but also 1 day and 1 week after viewing. And what do we see? Well, first of all, we do see an effect for movie, right? So people were remembering more moral scenes from the Truman Show. We also see that there was actually a negative effect for affiliation on thinking about a moral scene, as listing a moral scene as the most important. So that might mean that people are thinking about other types of things versus just character liking when they're thinking about these moral decision scenes. Engagement was positively related. Well, that makes sense. The more engaged I was during viewing, the more likely I am to pinpoint what are, a priori defined as sort of important scenes in this film. And then we also found authority was negatively related to remembering a moral scene, and this has to do, I think, with the content of the movie, because Truman Show is really about breaking free of authority. So the other thing that's interesting to me, at least, is that these effects don't really degrade. So people don't really change their mind after they've decided what the most important scene was. They didn't necessarily flip it to something else. Now, there are some scene differences, which I believe I'll get into in a slide or two. So what can we learn from this? Well, these scenes that people were able to agree as a priori defined, fairly important decision points that a character makes are also the most likely to be remembered. Great. Memory is shaped by engagement, some character affiliation, and some aspects of character morality when they're central to the story of the film. But we didn't see a whole lot of effect for character attention or consistency, which was a little surprising, quite honestly. And I think the most important thing, the most interesting thing, is that the scene memory is fairly stable across this short time frame. Now, as you know, we started with this model where we start from content and we go to effects. But what if we took these data and we flipped them around? What can people's memory about scenes tell us, perhaps, about film? Right? Well, if we look at the actual scenes that people are remembered, maybe we can work backwards using the memory as sort of our indicator variable and say, hey, maybe it's telling us something really important about the story itself. Right? How could we link these most remembered scenes with the central character and story impressions? And so what I have here is just these are just the moral scenes, not the moral and non-moral. Again, though, if you looked at the numbers, the non-moral memory scenes were like fairly low. The frequency was just low. So if we look at, for example, well, maybe it's better here, these different types of scenes, what we can see is that the scenes that are remembered are really, really central to sort of understanding the character and understanding the main conflict of the story, right? So when I presented this work before, people said, well, yeah, obviously the last scene of Truman is the most remembered because that's like the narrative climax, like that's the end. Obviously, there's going to be this effect. And I said, okay, that's fine. But the Eduardo confrontation, where Mark Zuckerberg is confronted by his friend Eduardo, is not actually the finale of the film. It takes place about 3/4 of the way through. And but it was very central to defining Mark's character in terms of the fact that he was going to always sacrifice his friendships in order to get money and power, right? So what I think is helpful or interesting about this is that we can kind of take these scenes and then work backwards and say maybe they're linked to the main moral of the story. So that's what we're doing now. So this is, we'd asked people what the main plot of the story was, and you would think, quite honestly, I love my students, they're Michigan State undergrads, they're not film students, other people have mentioned this before. They're not like really interested in yeah, I've got 5 minutes. They're not really interested in expounding a whole lot on art and film, but they they can, they just aren't as interested, right? And this is free recall, I just was getting what I could from them. And but look at these beautiful messages from Truman Show, right? I said, what's the main plot? Oh, the main plot is finding your inner purpose and breaking free from control. Like, oh, okay, I hear you. You know, following the beat of your own drum and standing up for what you believe in. And also self-fulfilling prophecy, which we had just taught in class that week, so I'm happy they were listening. Okay. And the world is what you make of it, right? Okay, like, this is kind of interesting, right? Maybe we can do a cool thematic analysis here. Maybe there's something here. Maybe there's a there. And then I look at what was the main plot of the social network, and 99% of the answers are the story of how Mark Zuckerberg created Facebook. You know, this is the variance I get. Mark stole the idea of Facebook. The creator of Facebook grows to be a jerk. Mark started Facebook while making and losing friends and getting sued. So I think there's something going on here that maybe we haven't captured in previous analyses, right? Which we're going to start to look at in terms of thematic analysis of these plots and hopefully connecting it to the things that people are remembering. So looking ahead, what are we doing? Well, as I mentioned, we're starting with these thematic analysis and seeing if we can connect the scenes that people remember and the ratings that they had of the characters with sort of how they derived the main plot of the movie. Kind of like what we did with Little Toot the other day, right? Similar. The other thing is we collected 6-month data as well. So we asked them again 6 months later. The N was fairly small because we had quite a bit of attrition as people moved on to other things. But we do have enough of a sample that we can look at the 6-month change, and I'm very curious to see how these things have progressed over time. We're also looking at alternate ways of defining those sort of memorable scenes and narratives, although I think we did a pretty good job if you look at the memory data. I think there's like we did a good job of finding the scenes that people were going to care about and think were the most important. But there are other ways that we can do it. So we're working on those now, things like event segmentation, right? Thinking about when things start and end, what things are important. Looking at the text of the film itself, looking at the scripts in order to see if there are ways that we can computationally define different kinds of conflict, right? So we don't have to have 4 students watch all the films and go through a rigorous vetting process. The other thing we could do is, if you remember, I said that we had them code 8 films, right? They trained on Dark Knight and Hunger Games, but we have the coding here for Fargo, Knives Out, Rain Man, and The Help. So what I'm doing this fall is we're going to replicate this experiment, but I'm also going to take the decision scenes and see if there are other ways that we can rate them. For example, I'm very interested in a theory from media psychology called disposition theory, which predicts how we can understand enjoyment as an intersection of our hopes and fears for the character, our liking and disliking of the character, how moral we find the character to be, and the outcomes for that character. So I'm looking to see if I can apply some disposition theory-based coding to these specific scenes. And I think I'm right at time there, and I didn't even have to race to do it. So thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate it very much.
Okay, terrific. All right, so I will aim to finish by 5:15, which will give us 15 minutes to discuss. So I kind of slightly drew the short straw here and being the last speaker, but I will try and get through my stuff as efficiently as possible. Let me use this occasion to quickly thank Carl for initiating the project, for leading the project, and in particular for inviting me to be part of it. It's been a great pleasure working with Carl and with Dan and with Alison on this project. Now, in Carl's introduction, one of the things he talked about was the fact that it's by design an interdisciplinary project, and of course that's a big ambition of many people in this community. So roughly speaking, of course, what you're hearing today in terms of the last 2 of the 3 talks is Alison very much gave you kind of like an empirical emphasis. I'm going to give you a kind of philosophical, conceptual emphasis. But I think we'd all share the underlying assumption that Alison, is also implicitly drawing on conceptual stuff. It can't be otherwise. And I am implicitly drawing on various empirical assumptions. It can't be otherwise. So the kind of underlying principle here is we all think that we're going to come up with a much more interesting and richer end result by putting these distinct kinds of methods together. into conversation with one another. So, what is reflective equilibrium? Now, reflective equilibrium, many of you will know this already, but is a type of deliberation first described by Nelson Goodman, but anointed, given a name, and developed by John Rawls, the political philosopher, in the context of moral and political philosophy. So Carl very generously attributed reflective equilibrium to me. I wish that were true, but in fact it's John Rawls who gave it the name in the early 70s. And there is an enormous literature on this topic in philosophy and the social sciences, but only a tiny amount in relation to aesthetics as a kind of particular domain. So Catherine Elgin is really the only figure who has kind of said much of any kind of significance about the relevance of reflective equilibrium for the domain of aesthetics. So what is this phenomenon of reflective equilibrium? Well, in a second I'm going to give you a highly simplified example, but let me give you the kind of abstract characterization first of all. So it's a type of deliberation involving the dynamic adjustment of and search for mutual support amongst our beliefs, moving backwards and forwards between our judgments concerning particular objects and events, and on the other hand, more abstract principles which bear upon them. Okay? So that's a kind of concise, concentrated characterization of what the idea is. And let me kind of say is, it's as fundamental an idea as, say, induction, deduction, abduction, right? It's that general an idea. It's supposed to identify a fundamental part of kind of rationality. So here is my simplified example. Say you find yourself with these two beliefs. On the one hand, a kind of general commitment to freedom of expression. People should be free to express their beliefs without constraint. On the other hand, you find yourself with a particular judgment. So here's where we've got the idea of two levels, right? General principles, and then judgments about specific incidents or events that you encounter. Say you find yourself thinking X, some individuals shouldn't be allowed in the course of expressing their beliefs to incite violence against Y, right? Now those two things aren't consistent with each other, right? So the idea of reflective equilibrium is if you're going to get coherence amongst your belief states, you've got to adjust one or both of those things, right? So you either start to qualify your principle and say, well, it's not freedom of expression without qualification that can stand, or you've got to kind of somehow adjust your particular judgment. Well, maybe it wasn't really an expression of an attempt to incite violence, it was just a very robust expression, right? So there are different ways in which you can bring your kind of beliefs into alignment with each other, right? But the core idea is when you're seeking reflective equilibrium, you've got to go through that process of adjustment. Okay, so the purpose of reflective equilibrium in any given domain, right? So remember, this is much more richly developed in moral and political philosophy in particular, but its purpose is epistemic justification. In other words, having the best possible grounds for believing something and arguing something and defending it, right? So if we apply that to the context of aesthetic appreciation, or let's say film criticism as a species of aesthetic appreciation, then we'll say that film criticism, aims at increasing our understanding of a film or a cluster of films, right? It's supposed to kind of like do something objective, right? It's supposed to improve your understanding and your knowledge of that work. And so reflective equilibrium, for that reason, is a normative enterprise, right? It's concerned with oughts rather than just ises, right? It's concerned with kind of how things should ideally be. And I'm going to just use a little anecdote from an encounter that Iris and I had at Starbucks at lunchtime, just to kind of concretize the is-ought distinction. So we went there and I ordered flat white. And the barista, if we can call him a barista, the barista said, "Would you like a small or a large flat white?" And I said, "There's no such thing as a large flat white," right? I was expressing an ought, I mean, clearly Starbucks think there is a large flat white, but those of us who exist in that world know that a flat white comes in a particular size of serving, and at the level of the ought, there is no such thing as a large flat white, right? Now, the reason I'm dwelling on this point is that I think that one of the most significant challenges, arguably the most significant challenge of interdisciplinary work, which works across the sciences and humanistic disciplines, is the is-ought distinction, right? It's how is the knowledge that you gain from scientific inquiry relevant to the kinds of questions, the normative questions, which we often ask in humanistic disciplines. And if I get the time, I'll offer one thought about the way in which it can be relevant right at the end of the talk. Okay, I'll skip that for time. Right, so how is reflective equilibrium relevant to us? Now, the us here is, first of all, us broadly as, this whole community. In a second, I'm going to narrow the question down to the project that we three are representing today. So one way in which I argue that reflective equilibrium is relevant to us broadly is that I think it plays a central and significant role in the act of aesthetic appreciation. And this is an argument I've made in its full metal jacket form in this paper, which has been very recently published, so forgive me for the self-plug there. And I'll give you a quick flavor of this argument, one sort of strand of it in just a second. So if I bring this forward here, the idea here is that in appreciating any given work, so a film, my example today is going to be The Banshees of Inisherin. So by appreciating, I mean coming to a reasoned understanding and appraisal of it. The first stage of that, I argue, is a matter of situating this work against a range of background schemas concerning relevant artistic genres, traditions, and categories, right? So one of the first things you're doing when you're encountering a film or any other artwork for the first time is sort of trying to place it in aesthetic space. What sort of work is this? What traditions is it drawing on, right? Because that helps you to kind of understand how to respond appropriately to it, what sense to make of it. So if I now switch to this quotation, I am going to have an extract from The Banshees of Inisherin in a couple of minutes' time, but for now I'm just working with this quotation from Pete Bradshaw, who is the film critic for The Guardian newspaper. And let me just quickly read you this description he gives of the film. This is very close to the beginning of his review of the film. He says, Martin Madonna's new film is a macabre black comedy of toxic male pride and wounded male feelings, a shaggy dog story of wretchedness and a dance of death between aggression and self-harm, set on an imaginary island called Inisherin off the Irish coast. It's happening in 1923. During the Civil War, the additional symbolic acrimony is offered to us on a take-it-or-leave-it basis. As with so many of Madonna's works, the glint of the unburied hatchet is all too visible in the murk, and the setting is a stylized and ironized Irish rural scene not so very far from John Millington's Singe. Now, I won't carry on the last sentence. What I draw your attention to, I mean, there's some very nice, expressive writing there, but I've kind of put in bold the kind of the artistic categories and traditions that he's alluding to help you begin to place this work, right? This is the kind of work it is. These are guidelines to help you make sense of it. And of course, you don't have to agree with them, right? But this is his take on the work. So what I do in the article I alluded to a couple of moments ago is essentially argue that the way in which this counts as an example of reflective equilibrium is that what the critic is doing is they're moving between levels, right? Remember, this is key to the project of reflective equilibrium. You've got general principles and particular judgments. So he's kind of taking general principles about different kinds of genre and aesthetic work. He's looking at this particular work, and he's moving backwards and forwards between them until he says, this is what it is. This is what this thing is. This is the best understanding and appreciation we can have of this particular work. So, as I say here, the first job of an appreciator, a critic being nothing other than or more than a professional appreciator, is to discern exactly where in this large, complex, and heterogeneous web of relations a work is to be situated. And it's here that we see this back and forth movement characteristic of reflective equilibrium. Okay. Now, let me turn our attention for the last few minutes to how I want to suggest that the idea of reflective equilibrium might be more narrowly pertinent to this particular project. Remember, the project as a whole is called Character Engagement and Moral Understanding. So my sort of starting point here was the following one. Across Dan's talk, the other two talks we've heard today, you've heard several mentions of the significance to the project of post-viewing reflection, right? The idea that we're not only engaged with a movie as we watch it, right? We're also going to be reflecting on it, sometimes at least, right? In the wake of seeing it, yeah? So that's what we mean by post-viewing reflection. And it struck me that there were at least two ideas already out there in the domain of aesthetic debate, which were relevant here. One is the notion of the reflective afterlife from Peter Kivy. I'm not going to talk about that today, but this was this is what led me to reflective equilibrium. I thought, how can we put the idea of reflective equilibrium to use specifically in connection with how we respond to characters, how that might bear upon our moral understanding, and how this connects with the reflective afterlife of a film. So, at this point, I think what we'll do is, could we run the clip, Claire, at this point? So I'll just give you one little bit of context for this extract from The Banshees of Inisherin. The story concerns two main characters, formerly friends. One of the two friends decides very abruptly and initially without any explanation that he's breaking off the friendship. He's just cutting the friendship dead. And what we're going to see here is kind of the second encounter where this friendship, breaks down. Okay? So Brendan Gleeson in the foreground has just finished playing a tune on his fiddle. It's important to know that he's got artistic and he's a musician with ambitions. Okay, let's run the clip.
Tomorrow, I'll write the second part of it. And the day after, I'll write the third part of it. And by Wednesday, there'll be a new tune in the world, which wouldn't have been there if I'd spent the week listening to your bollocks-porrocks solo on. So do you want to take your pint outside, or do you want me to take my pint outside?
I'll take my pint outside, because it's a shite tune anyways. I wouldn't bother with it.
I was too harsh yesterday.
Yesterday, he says. I know well you was too harsh yesterday. And today.
I just have this tremendous sense of time slipping away in me, Pádraig. And I think I need to spend the time I've left thinking and composing and just trying not to listen to any more of the dull things that you have to say for yourself. But I'm sorry about it. I am like.
Are you dying?
No, I'm not dying.
But then you've loads of time.
For chatting.
Aye.
For aimless chatting. Not for aimless chatting, for good, normal chatting. So, we'll keep aimlessly chatting, and my life will keep dwindling, and in 12 years I'll die with nothing to show for it. Bar the chats I've had with a limited man, is that it?
I said not aimless chatting. I said good, normal chatting.
The other night, 2 hours you spent talking to me about the things you found in your little donkey shite that day. 2 hours, Porrig. I timed it.
Well, it wasn't me little donkey's shite, was it? It was me pony's shite, which shows how much you were listening.
None of it helps me, do you understand? None of it helps me.
We'll just chat about something else then.
Okay, thanks, Clay. You can pause it there. Okay, so let me just get the slides back out. Right. Okay, so I'm not going to go through this quote from Noel Carroll. I'll just work with the couple of bullet points at the top. So a starting point here, when we want to think about how this idea of reflective equilibrium might have a specific bearing on how we engage with characters and how that impacts upon moral understanding is, starting point is characters evaluate and judge one another. We just saw an example of that, morally characterizing and assessing their own and each other's actions, and we, in turn, continue this process, right? And all of that is characterized, right, by reflective equilibrium. Now, the quote from Carroll is one where he kind of fleshes that idea out, and is one of the rare occasions where he actually uses the concept of reflective equilibrium to describe the way in which we collectively exchange thoughts about fictional characters. So in this case, here again we've got another critic. This is A.O. Scott, and I know I have to finish, Carl, so I'll just wrap up very quickly. A.O. Scott of the New York Times explicitly states in his review of the film, it's hard for Patrick, that's the Colin Farrell character, or the audience to accept what's happening, let alone to understand it. We ask ourselves, is Colm, Brendan Gleeson, is he on any kind of morally firm ground in abruptly breaking off his friendship with Patrick? Is it a legitimate, even an admirable assertion of personal autonomy on his part, a kind of honesty, or is it a self-regarding cruel act, a kind of outsized betrayal of friendship, right? So the situation, right, of these two characters tips us, if the film is working anyway, into those kinds of questions about the particular actions and the larger moral principles that we might justify or not justify those actions against the context of. So that's the general idea of how reflective equilibrium bears upon moral understanding. Just to quickly allude to the idea that I said there might be a significant connection, okay, between the normative and the descriptive. The idea is this, as I've set it out very quickly. If our actual practices, the way we make films, the way we talk about them, the kinds of things, in other words, that we broadly as scholars and scientists try to capture on a descriptive level, if we can make the assumption that those practices are a kind of imperfect realization of the things that we think ought to happen, then that kind of empirical research is playing a role in relation to the normative questions and debates that we often have in the humanities. And there I will leave my comments. Thank you.
We have time for some questions. We need to cut this off at 5:30 so that we can make it to the screening on time. So are there any questions for any of us on this broad array of topics that we dealt with all too superficially?
Thanks for a very interesting panel. I just have a question for Murray about reflective equilibrium. I get very clearly how the deliberation about abstract moral principles and examples of those principles in action might be a question of reflective equilibrium, precisely because you're dealing with abstract principles that you may be revising in the light of empirical information. But I don't understand why the relationship between the framework of background framework of understanding a film and the film itself would be an example of reflective equilibrium in the same way, because you're not dealing there with abstract principles that might be revised in the light of empirical information. So that doesn't seem to me an obvious case of, if I understand it correctly, of the principle.
Well, it's not. The argument isn't that the form that reflective equilibrium takes is going to be identical in every domain, right? So you have to start with the moral case, because that's the kind of paradigm in the field and where it's been most fully developed. But the idea is there is a sufficient parallel between different levels of judgment that you're making, right? So the thought would be, given this, let's take this work, The Banshees of Inisherin, is it a comedy? Is it a black comedy? Is it a tragedy by the end of the film? We're trying to situate it into familiar categories, and we might end up with the judgment none of those more general categories are sufficient to give an account of this work, and we need actually to posit something new which properly explains it. Now, I'm not going to elaborate more because we've only got 10 minutes more, but that is the kind of thrust of the answer I give you, that it's not precisely like the interlevel mutual adjustment that you find in the moral domain that I began with, but there is sufficient similarity to make the case that it's another species of reflective equilibrium.
Thank you. Again for Murray. In your last drawing, you had Carol and Kivy, and you called it the afterlife of reflective evaluation. I wondered how that ties in with Allison's research. And also, you make it sound as if it's individual, and I'm sure it's not, but the studies of students sounds like they're pretty individualized too. And I would have thought that there's certainly for Rawls, you have to have a social dimension to all this. So where is that coming in? Does it?
I'll say something very quickly, and then maybe Alison or Carl will want to add something too. In the tradition, the Rawlsian tradition, two distinctions are made, which I skipped over. One is between individual and collective reflective equilibrium. So it's recognized, as is the case in film appreciation, that much of it happens collectively and socially, right? That we're exchanging views about the optimal understanding of a film. Well, that's the most pertinent part of the answer to your question. So.
Yeah, and so for my answer, I'll say that when I got the initial results from the film viewing and then the reflection data that I had in terms of sort of how people were remembering the scenes and looking at that individual variance, both between the films and within the films, right, as pertains to actual individual reflection, I had a little bit of a panic attack, and I called Murray and Carl and said, not a panic attack, but a bit of a panic, and I called them and said, this is where I need your help, right? You understand what's going on in the film and understand sort of the artistry, and why would it be engendering these really different but still thematically consistent across large groups of responses in the students in these ways. And we had a very large discussion. I wasn't able to get into it in my presentation today, but they gave me several ideas for when we do the replication study this fall, certain things to isolate. Like, for example, Murray, you talked about the presence of a moral interpreter in the film who acts as sort of a third person to bounce ideas off of. So these are the types of things. I have a large list of sort of ideas from film philosophy and film studies that I can pull in to look at in the future.
Hi, my question has to do with the opposite of this reflective equilibrium, and then kind of the questions for all three of you, just to see how you accommodate this in your framework. And that is to do with stereotypes or that kind of implicit bias or microaggressions in the film that just gets assumed. And often they do have a harmful impact, and that goes under the radar and not aware. So I'm just curious, how do your kind of moral engagement framework for all of you, how do you kind of accommodate that kind of moral effects to the audience?
Well, that's where I think, as far as my theory of moral engagement goes, difference between smooth engagement and rough engagement would come in. And that I think that a lot of times more complex films that encourage rough engagement are precisely the kind of films that sort of undermine conventional ways of thinking and viewing, conventional ways of interpreting events, generic conventions, etc. That kind of deliberative thinking is often engaged in cases where characters don't react in the way that our sort of implicit biases would think they should or do or normally do, and where narrative situations don't turn out the way that we would normally think they would. I think that some of the best films are the films that sort of work against our implicit biases and lead to some kind of deliberative imagination for that fact. That's how it would work for my theory.
I'm just thinking in terms of time. Should we let him, or do you want to say anything on that, Alison? Okay.
This is a question to Carl. You said in the beginning that you don't like these categories as immersion and transportation. And I just want to ask you, what do you do with the body of empirical work that measure transportation and immersion in literature and in cinema? So they are measuring something that doesn't exist?
Well, I think that theoretical models that are rooted in ambiguous or I don't want to say nonsensical, that's not what I mean, but concepts that are ill-defined, or perhaps even that describe psychological processes that are technically impossible or psychologically improbable, can lead to a lot of research that for that reason is severely compromised. And I know that Alison agrees with me on that. So the theory of transportation, in fact, I believe you said that Melanie Green is a friend of yours. So I won't ask Alison.
I'm a little nervous now, but yes.
I won't.
No, she is.
Go ahead.
One of the reasons Melanie Green and I are friends is because when I first met her, I said, I think this is wrong. I think this is dumb. And she said, yeah, okay. And, then we had a beer. And, and it was perfect, right? And that's actually, Carl and I have also had this conversation, also actually with drinks, I believe.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
okay.
Absolutely.
But this is how these conversations are best, right? But I think that Carl really hit the nail on the head here with the definition of the concept. And when you talk to Melanie about it, she's so sweet. And she said, yeah, well, I was also a graduate student, when I came up with this. And it's run away from me. It's now other people's concepts. And I don't think it's not that there's not something there that you're capturing. I think there definitely is. I just don't know. It's like the appreciation or eudaimonic scale too, right? It might be measuring too much. It might be going too far. It is reliable, and you can sort of correlate it with other sorts of phenomena that you're interested in. So in that sense, yes, there's a there. But I think what Carl's talking about is like, how do we differentiate it from other similar concepts, and in what ways does that matter, right? And I think that's really the crux of the issue. And until we can answer that, I think talking about it in terms of maybe it is an illusory concept is sort of an interesting way of approaching that issue.
Yeah, concepts like identification and absorption are used in probably 55 million different ways. Yeah. And if you're doing empirical research, you might not be using the terms in the same way that several other researchers have. So it's not even clear that people are measuring the same thing. So I think that the term character engagement, which of course Murray came up with and narrative engagement are sort of neutral terms that don't imply any kind of potentially misleading psychological description of the process and allow for a lot of variation within narrative engagement. So I think those are better terms. Even if you define the term identification in a psychologically legitimate way, that doesn't mean that people who read your work will do so, because the term has had so many varied meanings, many of which imply a kind of impossible sort of mind meld idea of what we do when we engage with characters. I don't know, Murray.
I think that's probably another panel's worth of conversation.
Yeah, you're right.
Quite honestly.
Yeah.
Yeah. With time, I think we're probably there.
One more question. We have 1 minute. Anything else?
There's Jonathan has a question.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks for the great presentations. Just to follow up on that last point, Carl, are you implying that you were saying narrative engagement is fairly neutral, but it seemed like Allison's point was that the biggest risk is that the construct includes too many discrete elements. So, like narrative engagement, to me, my intuition is that that is a very broad category that includes many different types of kind of phenomenological experiences. So I'm curious what your thought about that is.
You're absolutely right. Character engagement is designed to be a very general term that can encompass many different sorts of psychological processes that are, and I tried to demonstrate some of those in my slides. The word identification, I think, is unclear because in some cases it refers to character engagement generally. Anytime you're engaged with a character, you're identifying with a character. And in some cases it applies to a very specific idea of what engagement means. So it's a fundamentally ambiguous concept, in my opinion.